Okay. Hello everyone and welcome to Museum of Sydney and Sydney Living Museums. I'm Caroline Butler-Bowden, one of the Assistant Directors at Sydney Living Museums. And welcome to Protecting Iconic Houses, the last in our series that of course has complemented the Iconic Australian Houses exhibition, which sadly closes today, and there's a lot of people coming in for its final showing, but we're happy. We're extremely happy that the Australia Council has funded a tour of Australia to 9 different museums and places. So it will live on and hopefully you can catch it again. But we have Karen Mccartney, the curator of the show, in the front row. Now, before I begin today, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we meet today. And of course, this is very special land, the place of contact, first contact, and the site of first Government House, and pay my respect to elders past and present. Now, the focus, of course, of the whole series has been the exhibition upstairs and the kind of broader range of iconic houses that we have on display. But today we turn our attention into how we can protect houses of this era. Now, in kind of thinking about today, I sort of look back to the 19th century and the idea of the beginning of protecting, and the formation of the Society of the Protection of Ancient Buildings, SPAB as it was known, was a landmark in the early development of the idea of protection and conservation. In the founding manifesto of SPAB in 1877, William Morris, of course, well known to us as the leader of the arts and crafts movement, called for protection in the place of restoration. And he urged those responsible to show no pretence of other art and resist all tampering with either the fabric or ornament of the building as it stands. And I think it's important to remember that when we're talking about houses of course, of mid-century. And of course, that's really core to us as an institution, what we're talking about today. We manage, we care, we manage, we love the 12 properties in our care, and of course there are many houses. You know, of course there's Rose Seidler House, but everything from Elizabeth Farm, Elizabeth Bay House, Vaucluse House. And of course it's always about the integrity of the architecture as well as the stories of those places, the conservation and really respecting those buildings and their history. And so that when we do contemporary adaptations to them, we always make sure that they look contemporary, so that we're not kind of playing or trying to copy what was there in the past. But of course, not everything can be a museum. We'd be the first to advocate that. And of course, with houses, they're actually best if they're continuously lived in. So today we'll hear from 2 leading writers and lecturers on the topic, but also 2 people who live in iconic houses. But first of all, we'll hear from Ian Innes. Ian is my colleague. He's one of the other assistant directors, and he's really the head of our heritage and conservation. He knows every intimate detail of our buildings, but also has a huge knowledge of ancient Greece and all sorts of other parts, and we learn from him every day in the institution. He'll be followed by Annalisa Capurro, who's been a real advocate and friend of our institution for very many years. She's a design lecturer at TAFE, and she manages to always bring this period to life, as we will see today. And then Philip Goad probably needs no introduction, really. He's clearly the best writer on architecture in the country, and we lure him up from Melbourne once a year for something, and we're delighted that today is that day when he's joining us. So I welcome Ian. And before we start, obviously turn off your mobile phones. Please don't take photographs or record the event. And audience surveys will be sent to you tomorrow. So welcome Ian, thanks.
Thank you, Caroline. I hope I live up to that. I'm going to try and be brief because Annalisa and Philip are going to show you 2 incredible houses. But I thought I should start by talking about iconic houses and modernist houses from the museum's perspective and what it's like operating a house museum. So where better to start than a really iconic house, the Rose Seidler House, which was gifted to the state of New South Wales by Harry Seidler in the early 1990s, and which we operate as a house museum. Now, if you haven't already been there, I'm sure you've been there lots of times, but if you haven't, you're going to go to see it really soon because it's quite an incredible experience. The House Museum internationally is going through a really strange period of transition where we know that visitation has declined and people's expectations of what they experience at a house museum has changed substantially from where it was in the 1980s and 1990s. So visitors are now much less satisfied with the sort of walk around, look at some furniture, stand behind some ropes and walk out again type of museum experience. And we find that visitors are keen to have a much more sort of participatory or immersive experience, and certainly one that's much more personalised around either the people who live in the place, the people who may have lived there in the past, how they lived, how they may have worked with their architect, etc. So the option of house museums like the Seidler House, I think, is a very limited one. There are probably only a handful of houses, say in New South Wales, that will ever eventually be able to become house museums, partly because of the logistics of opening a house to the public. And with the Seidler House, we're very lucky that it's right at the end of a suburban street and it has a long driveway to quite a private entrance. So the neighbours don't have to endure, the inconvenience of people coming and going and parking in the street. But most houses are not like that. In fact, I had the great pleasure of visiting Mccartney's house in Clontarf a few weeks ago. And of course, it's in a really densely packed street and there's a really long driveway that goes past 4 other houses. So the option of that ever becoming a museum house, to me, seems very limited. The other thing that happens when you open a house to the public and you set it up as a museum is that you, in a way, slightly sort of sterilise what it's about, because it inevitably comes with what I'm going to call a curatorial narrative, which is the sort of mindset that the curator brings in how to present and interpret the place. And with the Seidler House, obviously, it's very much about Harry as a really important figure in modernism in Australia, the house being the first really significant international style house after the Second World War, and the incredible popularity that it achieved really quickly after it was built. Associated with that is this sort of fantastic story of Harry shipping out all the furniture from New York, going to Knoll and working out, buying the Eames chairs. And somebody, I think his brother or cousin had said, look, when you get to Australia, there's not much here, it won't be very good, so anything you want, you better bring with you. So, bringing everything. And for me, that's a really perfect example of this idea of Gesamtkunstwerk, which permeated Bauhaus thinking, but originated in the sort of Vienna Secession. It was the idea that the house could be treated as a totally integrated work of art. So the architect not only designed the house and the interiors and maybe the landscape setting, but also, if he didn't design the furniture, he specified and selected the furniture, and sort of everything right throughout the place, right down to the kitchen china. So I think the Seidler House is a really good example of that, of Harry's hand in everything, down to the Rosenthal dinner service, the Eames chairs, the design of the mural, the position of the house in the landscape, etc. Now, just as a sort of different option for how you can protect and present and preserve an iconic house is another really famous house by Californian architect Pierre Koenig, dated from 1955, belonged to a family called Stahls. And when you go on their website, they've got a lovely website. And if you check it out, I think the really nice thing that they've got on their sort of sidebar is nobody famous ever lived here. They thought of themselves as this really ordinary family, and they commissioned Pierre Koenig because Bucky Stahl liked modernist houses, and Koenig did this house, which must be one of the most photographed houses in the world. It has this astonishing view over Hollywood and Los Angeles. But the experience of going there is quite different to museum houses, because the house is still owned by the family, and it's a sort of free roam visit. So the furniture's not the original furniture, it's all new stuff that's been brought in. But the idea is that you can sit in all the chairs, you can check out the bathroom, you can wander through every room and act as if you're there for a little cocktail party or for afternoon drinks. And so it has it's a fantastic experience. It's unlike being in a museum. Now, how long the Stahls can keep going doing it, I don't know, but at the moment it's a wonderful experience. And the really interesting thing I thought about this house was that the way they open it to visitors and charge is that it pays its own way, which is a very unusual thing for museum houses or museums to do generally. And here's a sort of famous view of the pool, which Annalisa is going to do some more detail on. But now, there are some other houses that are in institutional ownership, apart from museums, and this is another incredibly famous house designed by the Viennese architect Rudolf Schindler for himself in Los Angeles in 1922. It's one of the most influential houses of the 20th century, certainly the first half of the 20th century. And we're very lucky that it's been preserved at all, but it's administered by a sort of arts foundation who treat it not so much as a furnished house and the experience of visiting the Schindlers, but really as a display space that you put things into. So for me, having sort of studied architecture, I was there on my knees worshipping at this sort of, fountainhead of this great architect. But I think for people who are looking for a more immersive experience, it may be slightly disappointing. And then the other model for preserving houses, which I think is the most important one and which everyone can actually participate in, which Caroline's already alluded to, is the idea that the best use for a historic house is for it to be lived in and for people to continue to care for it and manage it and love it for its own inherent properties. And Annalisa is certainly going to show you how that's flowed through into how she approaches the care of her house. So on the left-hand side are two Pettit and Sevet houses from the 1960s in St Ives and beautifully cared for. And on the right are some images of Annalisa's house, which she'll show you some more images of, I'm sure. Now, the greatest challenge of caring for houses like these is knowing when not to do things. And the greatest challenge of conservation is to know how to leave things alone and not want to improve them or change them. And I think, surprisingly, the heritage conservation principles that were evolved to deal with 19th century and 18th century buildings apply just as well to 20th century buildings, and particularly the Borough Charter principle of doing as much as necessary but as little as possible. And I think that's a great challenge for contemporary owners of houses who obviously want to upgrade the bathroom, kitchen, laundry, spa, they want a second garage, they want a family room and a video room, which are really the antithesis of what these houses were like. Karen Mccartney's spoken a few times, I think, about her sense of just being the custodian of her house and trying to touch it very lightly. The sort of houses I'm more worried about, because I think the Pettit and Sevets will find their buyers who will care for them and look after them beautifully, but this is a house that's just, it's in a suburban street near Parramatta. It's actually an architect-designed house from 1958. Geoffrey Lumsdaine was eventually quite a prolific architect. This was one of his very early designs. It was a project home designed to be built for between £3,000 and £4,000. So at the sort of entry level of housing, and there are probably in some of them in streets near you. The reason I'm showing this particular house is because it's in a suburban street which is subject to changes in the local environmental plan that happened in 2012, and the changes to the LEP allow for much denser development and a much larger type of house. So in the space of the last 2 years, every other house in that street has been demolished and rebuilt, and of course there's a sort of 6-bedroom bloated giant, and this is the one surviving. And I think because they're of a relatively lowly status, they're the most easily overlooked and the most likely to either be demolished or suffer from really unsympathetic alterations. This house was actually published quite a lot when it was first built. Some of the challenges maybe we'll talk about in the conversation a little later is that architects of the modern movement pushed materials and construction technology, much further than had been done before. And in the Sydney houses we'll look at, there was a lot of reliance on timber and unfinished timber, which comes with all sorts of issues. The other thing, the most difficult thing to preserve with old houses is often the garden. And Harry Seidler's the Seidler house had a particular vision about the house sitting in a designed landscape, which has gradually changed over time. And I thought you might like to see Harry's beautiful pencil drawings of the Rose Seidler house. The Rose Seidler house looks quite radical, particularly all those amazing photographs that show it like a spaceship. But actually it's a very conventional house in terms of design and materials and construction. Apart from the floating timber slab, it's basically a timber-framed house, and it's clad in timber. But of course it has all those beautiful details like, there's the hidden gutter at the top, and there's a hidden flashing. So that's all done behind. And you get all those classic problems of flat roofs with water ingress and water penetration, which of course we now spend a lot of time repairing and making good. The other thing that's very common, and that's the Seidler house is painted, and paint is a traditional way of preserving wood, but a lot of the other houses you're going to see are all natural unfinished timber, which of course makes them more prone to decay and deterioration. And that's where I'm handing over to Annalisa. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here to tell you about a few strategies that I've been involved with in protecting iconic houses. Now, the iconic house that's closest to my heart is obviously the Jack House. This is the Jack House when it was published in the Australian Woman's Weekly in 1958 after it won the Sulman Award of the year before. And this is Jack House today, complete with original wallpapers, original light fittings, original timber panelling, original joinery, original Marimekko fabric, more glorious wallpaper, original kitchen with original formica, totally intact 1957 bathroom, very rare, and it all sits in its original bush landscape as well. Now, as Ian alluded to, I feel very much like a custodian of this house and have done very, very little to it. I've taken on the idea of the Borough Charter. The only thing I've actually done is I've reconstructed the louver system that was boarded up and not working when I first moved in. But the thing that I'm most proud of doing to protect this house is I managed to get this house listed on the New South Wales State Heritage Register. Now, heritage listings are not sexy, okay? So I've made it my mission to make them sexy because I'm in good company. The Style House that you just saw, one of the most iconic houses of the 20th century, proudly displays its heritage listing. Then there's the iconic Coffman House in Palm Springs, one of the most famous, again, houses of the 20th century. And look, there it is for everybody to see. I'm a listed house. And a house that you may not know, not as famous, but definitely as iconic, is Steel House No. 2 by Wexler and Harrison. This house has the incredible title of being the first post-World War II house in Palm Springs to be listed on the National Register in America. So this house has opened the floodgates for so many others. Now, the thing about listing is they can only do so much. I'm an interior designer by trade, and I'm mostly passionate, obviously, about interiors, but they're notoriously hard to protect. So we need some other strategies. Tours are the best strategy I've come across. Get people into the interior to experience the interior. They'll see how important it is in relation to the architecture. Then there's the media. The media is really valuable in helping us sell these iconic houses to the public. Look at that title, Never Mind the Waterfront. This is a 50s modernist. That's the Australian Financial Review not 2 months ago. Now, I've been doing this for more than 20 years and I still can't believe there's a title like that on a newspaper. It's extraordinary. Mad About Mid-Century. Plea to save classic 50s homes from the dozers. The other thing I do is I write in design magazines and I give people tips when they're renovating houses. Some of my tips: don't destroy architectural history. You know, do your research. And my all-time favourite is don't overextend mid-century. Then there's blogs. Who doesn't love blogs? Blogs and Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. This gets our message out there. And then I also write in journals and architectural magazines as well. This is my dear friend Chris Osborne, who publishes Australian Modern, celebrates everything iconic post-World War II. But the thing about all of this is that we can make people aware, we can tell them their houses are important and they have to list them, but ultimately it comes down to one thing. That's what I've learnt in 20 years of doing this. It's about passion. If you get people to love it, they're going to look after it anyway. So how do we get them to love it? Well, Mad Men has helped our cause. With its iconic architecture, its iconic fashion, its iconic Barbie dolls. Then there's Tom Ford, one of my heroes. He owns his own iconic house in Los Angeles. His movie, A Single Man, set in the iconic John Lautner Schaefer house. Then there's Love Child, which brought the 60s back to Australia. And a beautiful little movie, if you ever get the chance to see. It opened at Flickerfest. It premiered this year in January, and it's been travelling around Australia. It stars the delightful Miranda Tapsell from the Sapphires. And if you look very closely near her face, do you recognise those louvers? It also stars the Jack House. So there it is. A Devil's Playground. That's about to come onto Foxtel. Any of you have got Foxtel? It's coming very soon. It's directed by Rachel Ward, It stars Toni Collette, it stars Simon Burke, and yes, if you squint, it stars the Jack House as well. Simon Burke lives in our house for the course of the show. Then there's Grand Designs. Now, Grand Designs has taught us all that a heritage listing is not something to hold us back. We can do extraordinary things with heritage listed houses. Then there's fashion shoots. There's the iconic Coffman house again and our gorgeous Miranda Kerr. Making it sexy, see? Sex sells. And here's the Jack House in Murray Clare. Also, events are really important. The 50s Fair, which is coming up next weekend. I hope you've all got your tickets. I shall see you there. The 50s Fair gets people to engage again in the architecture, in the interiors, and they're having fun. If people are having fun, they're falling in love, and that's what we want. Then there's Palm Springs, who does it better than anyone in the world. I've been making pilgrimages there for many years now. They have a festival called Modernism Week in February. It started with a weekend with a couple of hundred people 10 years ago. Next year they celebrate 10 years. Now they get 45,000 people. From that, the entire city has been rejuvenated and house prices have more than tripled. This is when the economy in America was going down. Now, how do they do it? They have bus tours. They have house tours. They have talks. There's Chris Osborne and I talking in Palm Springs. We were the first international speakers invited to speak, and we took Australian modern to the world. They have parties. Now, this is what gets everybody going. Parties in iconic houses. This is the Abernathy House. It's been published in Bell magazine in Australia as well. Everybody gets up, dressed up. Everybody has fun. But the thing is, it's all for a serious cause. It's all about preservation and it's all about protection. It's about looking after these buildings so we don't lose any more, because we have lost them, even in places like Palm Springs. This is the Maslin House by Richard Neutra, arguably the most iconic house in Palm Springs. It was sold by the Maslin heirs, and the new owners walked straight into the city council. They bought a $15 over-the-counter demolition permit, hired a bulldozer and demolished it, complete with all the furniture intact. It's still happening. This is Bill Kreisel, another modernist master. His archive is in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. This was his own house that he built in Brentwood for his family. In April this year, it was demolished. Who can forget Douglas's Snelling Kelly House 1 in Bellevue Hill? This was demolished just last year. So what do we need? We need passionate owners who are going to look after these houses. And one owner is an extraordinary friend of mine, Catherine Mailer. She bought the 1937 Miller House, also by Richard Neutra, in Palm Springs. This is what the house looks like today. This is what the house looked like when she bought it. It was the most notorious crack house in Palm Springs. Nobody wanted to know about it. She spent 13 years meticulously restoring and reconstructing all the original joinery. And she's not an architect or a designer. Then there's the Kronish House. Iconic houses can change people's lives, I can say that, but they can also change the course of history. This house is also by Richard Neutra in Beverly Hills. It was the only standing Neutra house left in Beverly Hills. When a demolition order was put on it, it went viral. It went international. We all wrote letters. We petitioned the Beverly Hills City Council. And what happened? They put a stay on the demolition until a sympathetic owner could come in and buy the house. But that's not the most important thing we achieved. What we really achieved is the Beverly City Council had no heritage ordinances before this. You could knock down anything and nobody cared. Now they were pressured to put heritage ordinances in. And as a consequence, many other cities in Los Angeles have done the same. My feeling is that we're all custodians and we're all looking after our cultural heritage. So my thanks to you is thank you for coming here today and celebrating the last day of Karen and Sydney Living Museum's extraordinary exhibition. So be passionate and save as many as you can. Thank you very much.
Wow. That's a hard act to follow. Sorry about the glasses, but I need them these days. So I'd like to say a few words about the protection, care and respect for iconic post-war modernist houses, and then finish with some reflections on my own house in East Hawthorn in Melbourne. Now, it would be easy to bemoan the loss of many iconic Australian houses of the 1950s and 60s. So many have gone, and this is one of them. This is Pelican, the Ken and Prue Meyer, Ken Meyer, son of Sydney Meyer of the Meyer Emporium fame. This is the Ken and Prue Meyer house designed in 1956 by Robin Boyd of Grounds Romberg and Boyd at Mount Eliza on the Mornington Peninsula. Unceremoniously demolished in the 1980s to make way for a placeless Tuscan palazzo by the bay, and without a murmur from anyone, and only known to us today through drawings and published images. This is a photograph by Kenneth Ross, and it's perhaps now just as iconic as was the house itself. Now, images like this one can become powerful mementos of lost heritage. Photographs can be used as persuasive documents to raise awareness of the uncertain contemporary plight of iconic modernist houses. A plight, of course, not unique to Australia. Dozens of Michael Olsen's melancholy images of the deserted and decaying summer residence at Frösökull in Sweden of 1960, designed by its architect owner and very enthusiastic nudist, Bruno Mathson, were collected together in 2010 into an entire book. And the book itself, it has more than 100 photographs like this. It's become a haunting ode to one of the masterpieces of Swedish post-war architecture. The book is a tragic lament for the unloved icon. But another key message of this book, though, and Ian and Annalisa have referred to this as well, is that the owner, or the one who dwells here, has departed. And that's the key aspect. It's been mentioned as well by Carolyn. This idea of ownership is a key thing. Awareness raising has been the intention behind exhibitions such as the 2004 show Cool, which focused on the 1960s Brisbane house, and more recently, if you go to Brisbane, Hot Modernism, now on show at the State Library of Queensland. These exhibitions, and the one currently showing here at the Museum of Sydney, and we must really thank Karen Mccartney for a great show. It's been, I think, an outstanding success. Together with the catalogues or books that might accompany them, are key ways of giving the public a clue about the essentially private status of iconic modernist houses. This is part of their problem. They're private, which are for the most part almost entirely hidden from view. Often in difficult landscape sites, hidden from public view, yet iconic for their design, iconic for their propositions about new ways of living, and iconic for their clients who were brave enough to venture into what still remains, I believe, as an unfinished experiment of modernism. In Victoria, only two iconic modernist houses are open to the public. The first is Heidi 2, the former John and Sunday Reid house at the Heidi Museum of Modern Art in Bulleen, which I'd highly recommend. If you haven't visited, go. And the second is the Robin Boyd house in Walsh Street in South Yarra, owned and operated by the Robin Boyd Foundation under the direction of Tony Lee. Saved by a campaign initiated by the National Trust and then later rescued by the Victorian State Government, the architecture profession, donors, and then also to the University of Melbourne, the Boyd House survives just. It's really remarkable. It only just survives. Through public programs like masterclasses, concerts, the occasional open house, and also, as you see on the right, design studios, where a new generation of design students are getting to experience firsthand and over several days the magic of post-war design. The house itself, though, it has to be said, is rarely open. It's fragile. And many of these houses are so fragile because of the nature in which, of when they were built after the war, when materials were scarce, materials were delicate, and engineers were much, much braver than they are now. The material nature and the frankly experimental structure, lean sense of materiality, often without handrails, make these extremely delicate objects to be shown lovingly, but it has to be said sparingly. Perhaps not surprisingly, the best form of protection, conservation and care comes from the non-institutionalised agency of dedicated home ownership. The slowest, but perhaps also the riskiest form of heritage protection. Now, all these iconic modernist houses in Melbourne survive. So top left, Roy Grounds' own house. Bottom left, Mary Featherston still lives in the Grattan Mary Featherston by Grounds, Romberg and Boyd, bottom left, with its fabulous translucent ceiling. The Gus House by McGlashan and Everest still lived in, still intact. And the emigre Viennese architect Ernest Fuchs, his house still lived in, recently sold. The new owner didn't know what to do with it, and thankfully the tenant is a relatively new architecture academic to Melbourne from Scotland, oddly enough, who's fallen in love with the house and would like a very long lease. Now, all these houses in Melbourne survive largely through the vision and empathy shown by their owners, like Annalisa, or tenants, and to live in these houses gently and be satisfied with their modesty and their necessary lightness. Each one is lived in by people prepared to understand the inherent qualities of these houses that requires a good degree of humility and respect. Now, that's not always easy. In the case of our house, I've had to feel good about pleasing decay. I just said this to Stephen Crafty when he interviewed me for an article in Habitus, and then he puts it onto the front title, Pleasing Decay. Great. As owners of the Herborn House, designed in 1929 by the Griffins employee Eric Nichols, who many of you might know made his career largely in Castlecraig, and he went on to achieve professional success here in Sydney. But by living in this house, my family has learnt the value of slowness by force of economic circumstance, largely. In 2000, when we bought the house, its roof was collapsing and the garden was a jungle. 15 years later, not a lot's changed. We've simply revealed its fabulous bones. I've made tiny additions, so the garage, top left of the plan, fell over, so I built a separate building, a little two-storey studio out the back. And on the plan on the right shows a little conservatory at the back of the house, top right. That's all we've added, and it's all we needed. That was the whole thing. So we've learnt to love its cave-like quality and the possumwee and the mould, and some of that's gone now. Despite my passion for the 50s, we've learnt to cope in a tiny kitchen. It's not that hard, believe me, and it's not that hard to treasure the small, and in adding, build entirely separately. I could be Robin Boyd, Philip Johnson or Guildford Bell in the garden, and it didn't matter. And then looking back at the icon, realise that yes, it is special, it is unique, but it has still allowed us to create our own memory palace that is home. Living here is slow and steady heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, the three of you, giving different accounts. I mean, I'll start with your families, really, in some ways, because, of course, the pair of you are sort of, in a way, in a living museum in some ways, because you've done so little to it. But I'm interested, you know, you're both stalwarts and so keen on it, but what happens with the kind of endless questions, no doubt, from your children, for instance, Philip, for different sorts of things to, make changes to kitchens and all the rest of it. I'm interested how you actually live in it.
The children are not always on board, it has to be said. The children would like, in the main house, an upstairs. Well, they're not getting it. My daughter particularly was very concerned about cracks, and there was sort of an embarrassment, I think. But last night, she had 3 friends over. They'd colonised the living room, and this is a 17-year-old, and it's okay. So I think they're secretly proud, but when we first moved in, it was diabolical.
Yeah.
I think. And I guess the other thing is that although it looks like we haven't done a lot, we took out, as Ian said, an amazing amount of stuff.
Yeah.
Carpets, stuff on the floor, insulation off the floor. And one of the key things we did was to put a new roof on it and heat it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which you need in Melbourne.
Yes.
Yeah. What about you, Annalisa? I mean, your family's here.
My daughter's in the audience here. Well, when we first moved in, my daughter was like about 6 years of age, and she used to come back from her friends' houses and say, "Mum, why didn't we buy the one across the road with the swimming pool?" And my friend's got an ensuite. I want an ensuite. So we went through a bit of that in the beginning, and she also wanted to paint her bedroom blue, and just like, you know, Philip said, I said, unfortunately not. We're not changing the colour of the room. But I think, again, over time, you know, she's become very, very proud of it now, and, you know, she is there helping with the tours when I do the tours now. So, yeah, I think it's one of those things that, you know, if you grow up in it, you actually appreciate it. Yeah.
Well, you've talked about tours and public awareness, and for many of you who know us well, Sydney Living Museums is not an advocacy or a listing institution, but of course by putting on events and programs and all the rest of it, it's about raising awareness. I mean, I'm interested, Annalisa, you talked about social media and all the other sorts of ways, but I mean, really, you know, Annalisa and Ian, what decides should be saved and, you know, what should be demolished? How do we... You know, how much is it Heritage Office and other sorts of things, and how much is it just community love and community awareness that actually saves?
Look, I think the thing that's going to really help us with this is actually the environmental crisis. I think there's an argument now for saving everything, not just because it's heritage listed, but saving it because the embodied energy and all of the materiality.
Yeah,
so
demolition,
I sort of can see that happening as, you know, this is becoming more and more of an issue. So I think that's probably going to save us even more. The other stuff's all the awareness, but I think, you know, from that point of view.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've seen that very much in kind of the idea of, you know, sustainability and, you know, the love of vintage and all the rest of it. I just haven't quite seen that same shift. Perhaps not for iconic houses so much, but for a lot of the everyday houses of the 50s and 60s across huge swathes of Sydney, at least. And I mean, surely it's their size is one of the main... Yes. I mean, Ian, do you want to talk a bit about...
The really noticeable thing about houses after the Second World War, because of limitations of materials and restrictions on what architects were able to achieve, but also a view about economy of means, was that they're quite small, and we've now become accustomed to living in really enormous houses for no particular advantage other than the luxury of huge amount of space. The thing that's most striking about going to a house like Annalisa's or Karen McCartney's house, or even the Rose Seidler house, is the wonderful economy that's achieved within quite a contained space. And they're also, partly because of the time they were built, but partly because of the views of the architect, they're very modest in the use of materials. So there's a sort of economical use of everything. So the Rose Seidler house is, you know, mostly timber and weatherboarding. There's stone used in a way that draws attention to the spatial complexity of the house, but there are no really luxurious finishes, and I think that's the great charm of them compared to a lot of contemporary houses, that the kitchens don't have the most expensive European appliances and the bathrooms don't have incredibly expensive handmade tiles, but there's a sort of beauty in how simple and straightforward they are. In terms of conservation, I think the biggest the thing that drives conservation more than anything else is community attitudes and communities lobbying, particularly local councils, because most heritage in New South Wales or Australia is listed in local listings, and they come about partly by architects and planners going around surveying suburbs or districts, but also really strongly from people within the community bringing places to the attention of the council or the Heritage Council and pushing for them to be listed.
So, I mean, what should become a museum? Because, I mean, you know, we as an institution get approaches, a number of approaches every year. A lot of people, that's their first idea, is obviously to make a museum out of an iconic house. And obviously there's a difference between iconic and great too, which I'm keen to kind of unravel. But in? I mean, do you have a particular view on what becomes a museum?
It's a conversation I've heard before, and I've heard an architect say, well, it has to be about the architect. It's all about great architecture. But I think it's, if you look at the other properties we own and manage, like Elizabeth Bay House or Vaucluse House, it's the architect and the owner and the sort of history of what happened there. So that's an interesting challenge. I think in terms of houses, the day of the state government acquiring more and more properties and preserving them as museums is over, and it will only ever be a very small number. It might be 3 or 4, and perhaps one of the later Harry Seidler houses, 20 or 30 years on. But I also think there are other lesser-known architects who worked in New South Wales after the Second World War, like Peter Muller, Bruce Rickard, Neville Grusman, etc. It would be really interesting to see Neville Grusman's little house in Rushcutters Bay, for example, which is a masterpiece and which could easily become a museum because of where it's located and sort of accessibility, etc.
So Philip, I mean, you're a leading historian and practitioner and architect in your own right. Living in a house, your Eric Nichols house, did it change the way that you write about architecture? I mean, it was about, you've been in there for I think 10 years.
Yeah. In terms of writing about architecture, I think being familiar with these iconic houses and experiencing them means that you have a much greater respect for the small and the modest, the potential for modesty in terms of additions. I think everyone gets carried away by the giant balloon size or ballroom sized additions that are made. But I think living in an iconic house means that you have so much more respect for different patterns over the time, but also too that not a lot's changed, and you can adjust very simply and easily, and people enjoy it. People love coming to our house. I have friends who say to us, "We're not jealous yet, but we love coming here."
Happy to visit, but not to stay.
But I think the main challenge in Melbourne is that it is the everyday 50s and 60s house which is at risk, not because another single house is going to go onto it, but because people are going to subdivide the block. And that's the key challenge, I think, for everyone at the moment. And a lot of councils, particularly in Melbourne, responsibly do their conservation study, and then council doesn't adopt it. And that's where community activism or community opinion has to come in and support the good intent, because I think it often happens that council politics means that these studies don't get adopted. And needless to say, even if a house is listed, it's not necessarily safe.
No, it's not.
That's right.
It's big,
Philip mentioned in passing the idea of modernism being a sort of unfinished project, and there's a really strange thing happened in Australia that maybe at the end of the 1970s or the 1980s, the community at large, which was never that confident about modern architecture, went, actually, no thanks, we don't want it. And I remember Harry Seidler lecturing at Sydney University, ranting about the proliferation of fake Federation mansions all over Sydney, saying there was more Federation houses built in the 70s and 80s than had been built 100 years ago. So there's this collective turning away from what modernist design was about, but what architects had tried to do, and that may have been for various reasons. One of the really nice things that I see happening now when I visited the Rose Seidler house, like for example, a few weekends ago, was quite young people visiting the house and saying they'd heard about it and they wanted to see what they could learn from it for their own house. So taking away from a house that's already 50 years old, 60 years old, a lesson for today, which is a really amazing transition to have happened.
And people do that with my house all the time. That come and say exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Well, that's really Sydney Open. It's people taking pictures of details and all the rest of it, obviously to take home and borrow those sorts of ideas. And Annalisa, you spoke about, your greatest achievement was getting your house heritage listed. I mean, for those in the audience, what role as the owner did you play in that?
Well, I was very proactive, and obviously Russell Jack was very proactive as well, because the architect's still alive. He's 89. So the two of us were involved with working with the Heritage Council. It's a very long process, I'll tell you that, even if somebody is proactive, an owner, in doing it. It probably took us 18 months to 2 years to go through the whole process, but obviously the Heritage Council, they've had a modernist theme for the last number of years, so they've been also very proactive in listing modernist houses. So, you know, the timing was perfect, that's what I can say. But yes, even, you know, sort of being in the industry, so to speak, and being on board and the architect being on board, it's still quite a long process, you know. So...
And I mean, I wonder at what, I mean, heritage for a lot of people is a dirty word, obviously not for the people in this audience and not for those who, you know, follow us as an institution closely. But, you know, and really that's, how do we shift that with, how does it become not a negative connotation, that heritage listing, as we read about in the paper, you know? I mean, is that through real estate agent? How do we kind of build that?
I think it's
that
the media.
awareness.
It's media.
Yeah, it's the media, because I've seen that.
Media and loving it.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
so I think there's a community awareness where it's actually acceptable to live in a modern house and to live in a smallish house, and also to find that there are a body of people out there ready to defend those houses.
And also buy them, because the thing is, it's not for everybody. You know, that's what I talk about all the time.
No,
it's not about it's for everybody, but I tell people all the time that come to me as a designer that, you know, are thinking of buying one and want some advice. You know, the idea is they're worried about if they're ever going to be able to sell it again. But there is a very select number of people that are prepared to pay more money to have that house because it's unique and rare. So that's what I tell my clients, and, you know, tell people it's actually, you don't want to cater for the masses. This is a very niche market. And then there are people that want to even pay more for it. So I think that's it. The rarity is the thing you sell it on.
I think the sadness, though, is that it's in particular areas of Sydney that you see it again, and I'm sure it's the same in Melbourne, Philip, that, you know, some areas it becomes part of the kind of in vogue thing to retain and to work with it, but of course we know that there's huge areas, and, you know, and a lot of those are those middle suburbs where...
Well, I think Ian's point about the Jeffrey Lumsden houses is key.
Yeah.
Same in Sydney, where the Pettit and Sevitt houses are at risk. In Melbourne, it's merchant builders. And I guess the sad thing is that those project houses were where architects wanted to produce a house for every man and improve the lot of suburbia generally. And so they were really solid, terrific little houses with some really good messages about modestly building to begin with, and if you wanted to grow the family, you could grow the house. But people don't do that anymore. They want everything with the theaterette and the rest. But there, I think that's the hardest battle.
Yeah, it is.
Because in the so-called difficult landscapes of Kew or on the North Shore, in some ways they're safer because the replacement to build on them is
more difficult.
Expensive.
That's right.
When we opened some houses back in May, and those two Pettit and Sevitt houses were open for a day, Ken Woolley visited and spoke, and he made the very interesting observation that even when Pettit and Sevitt were at their peak, it was a fantastic alignment of the aspirations and requirements of clients of a particular social demographic and the sort of suburb that they wanted to live in. So the range of suburbs that they were built in was fairly limited. And as the firm expanded and tried to move into new areas of Sydney suburbs, they discovered that the client's aspirations and the product that they were offering were no longer aligned so well. And that's when the business started to founder. So I think in terms of conservation, that still holds true, that Pettit and Sevitts on the upper North Shore that have been really well kept for are likely to survive in little enclaves, because there is a sort of educated clientele
sort of
who actually want them. But the Lumsden houses are really sort of too easily forgotten, and they're in middle ring suburbs where there's incredible pressure to redevelopment, you know, to knock down and rebuild and redevelop.
Last quick question before we take questions from the floor. I mean, the word iconic is bandied about, and, you know, there's, you know, we come into some criticism when that word is used. I mean, what is the difference between something that is iconic and something that's great? What's the sort of, what makes it? Is it something about it defining its period? I mean, I'll start with you, Philip. Is it?
Yeah, look, when you think of icons, you know, they have a religious connotation, and they're celebrated in almost sort of godlike images. And so I think we tend to look after the icons, tend to, but I think you used the word, Carolyn, you said there are great houses. I think this whole notion of custodianship or stewardship is actually where the real answer is, because the state can't purchase them. We found in Melbourne that the National Trust just simply couldn't afford it. They all fell in a heap. They made the gesture, but they couldn't do it. And
well, not unless things come with major bequest.
That's
they've got to come with money as well as the house.
That's right. And so it requires, I think, it sounds very grand, but that all of us can become custodians and play a role in stewardship, and that's a shared, I think, role. And so gradually, your great house can become iconic. Because I think of Calthorpe's house in Canberra, an ordinary Spanish colonial house, which I think is iconic of Canberra. And
it is, and of course it's about the place.
It's about the place.
Okay, we're going to take questions from the floor. We've got a couple of people with mics, and just please speak into it. So, can I take? Is there anyone with a burning question for? Yeah, up the back. Just wait for the mic to come.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. This is for all of you. I find it very interesting that, in the 60s, everyone hated Art Deco and destroying all the Art Deco. And then later on, everyone was trying to hold on to the Art Deco, and everybody it's quite fashionable to hold on to mid-century modern homes now. What do you think it's going to be like in about 30 or 40 years? Are we going to be holding on to 70s, 80s buildings?
Yes,
Definitely.
Definitely.
I think this is a great period. This is a great period. It's a period of great risk for architecture of the 70s and 80s. Right now, that there was fantastic architecture done in the 1970s at the sort of tail end of the modern movement, and it's not appreciated or loved and being demolished all the time. Also, generally not well recorded or documented. No. So we'll be fighting for those in 10 years' time or 15 years' time.
And I was going to say, in Karen's book, if anyone actually reads it, because mostly they look at the beautiful, photographs, but she talks about a bell curve, and that when a building's actually first built, it's totally loved, and that, a sort of appreciation goes downhill to 70 years. And that's when a building's at its most, I suppose, fragile, for the sake of being demolished or something. If it gets past 70 years, by the time it gets to 100 years, it's loved just as much as it was, and it always will be. So, like we love the Queen Victoria building now, or love Art Deco. So I think, that's the thing, it's this cycle. Yeah.
And the 70s are particularly at risk because there was so much exposed materials, tumbled bricks, and people have really wanted to paint over things. So paint is the serious... Or render. And that's irretrievable, largely.
Yeah. Question? No?
Just following on from the theme that...
Just speak into the mic, thanks.
Okay, following on from the theme that the best way to preserve these houses is to live in them, do you think there's a role for estate agents, you referred to it, where perhaps they market properties in the context of the period they were built, try to appeal to or connect with people who want to live in that type of building?
Totally. Modern House is one of the sponsors of this exhibition, that real estate agency is all about selling architect-designed houses, and it's modelled on other agencies in Europe and in America. So I think, with this cult of the vintage that Karen mentioned, there is an increasing market, and I think, this company's already expanded enormously just in the last couple of years. So
it's really worth going online and having a look. It's quite fun. You could just spend hours scrolling, looking what you might buy.
What other iconic house would I like? That's right.
Very interesting question about perhaps also getting information out to real estate agents and property managers about the stuff that they're dealing with. I wrote about a year ago to a real estate agent at Parramatta who was marketing one of the Kingsdown estate houses, which was designed by Neville Grusman. It had been really terribly butchered, but essentially it was there And his response was like, I don't think my clients will be interested in that sort of stuff. It was at the centre of one of the best examples of that, integrated development in Australia.
And I mean, from time to time, I remember, last year or so, McGrath Real Estate, they rang, they wanted, lectures and other sorts of things from our institution. I mean, there are some real estate agents who obviously see that as a real, that's actually a real incentive for people to buy, and that's very much, but it depends from area to area where kind of the vintage or kind of a particular period of housing. I mean, you only need to look at Balmain and other sorts of areas like that, where it's radically shifted in the past 10 years, or Haberfield. But really, the real challenge is much more middle ring, I think, where there's, and how we, congratulate the modern houses and the other sorts of sort of rare enterprises like that, but really get to the everyday real estate agent, down the road.
And the risk is, of course, that the enthusiastic buyer will then over-sanitise their 50s or 60s house and expand it, so it'll lose all of its character. That's the risk, when the agents perhaps enthuse it a little too much.
You talked about Pettit and Sevitt. In the early 70s, there was another firm that broke away from Pettit and Sevitt, a bloke named Jimmy White, set up Habitat. Now, Habitat went another direction with exposed beams and clinker bricks and simple designs like Russell Jack has done, and which Pettit and Sevitt done, and they were very simple and very well built houses. And then there was a couple of other merchant builders who were building at the same time. Yeah. What's ever happened to the Dayton Goffs and the Civil and Civics, which were all built around about the same time?
I think that they're starting to be quite well researched and documented. As Annalisa said, the New South Wales Heritage Council commissioned a thematic study of modernism in New South Wales about a year ago. It covers everything, including office buildings and factories and churches, but it's got quite a substantial section on houses and project homes in particular. And of course, there's a fantastic book published earlier this year called Designer Suburbs by Judith O'Callaghan and Charles Pickett, which captures quite a lot of those. But I think generally they're not listed anywhere. So I don't think there are any local council listings, which means they're at risk of unsympathetic redevelopment. It's that change of aesthetic that happens over time makes things that were done 35 years ago just not quite bearable. And then, another 5 years, new people are looking at them anew and thinking, well, actually, they have really wonderful qualities. So I think we're right at the cusp of that now.
I mean, the thing of publishing is really important. I mean, Karen's book, I think, has sold more copies than any other kind of architecture book in very many years. I think it's 10,000 or more, Karen.
Well, it's up the 50s, 60s, 70s, which has been more popular than the 70s, 80s, 90s because of what you're saying. It's in its sixth print run.
Sixth print run.
Amazing.
Yeah, 50,000, 16,000, yeah, which is incredible. I mean, a lot of books, you're lucky to sell 2,000, 3,000. I think Designer Homes might be going into a second print run, which is a really fantastic, it sold out, but often those print runs are 2,000 copies. So how do we kind of really encourage purchasing of books like that? And I think that, of course, in addition to grand designs and all the other sorts of programs.
Hi. I was just thinking about if you're, managing these houses. If I think of, say, a 60s, 70s, I would be thinking asbestos and so on. Would that be in any of the iconic houses, or is that not an issue you have to manage?
It's in my house.
It's undoubtedly.
Yes. It's in most of them.
It's probably in every house built between 1900 and 1976. There's some asbestos somewhere.
Yeah.
Is it an issue?
As long as you don't touch it.
So long as you don't touch it, it's usually not an issue,
That's where conservation and leaving things.
And so I think that's right.
Off.
Those conservation principles of doing as little as possible, respecting the building fabric that's there and not changing it, and making sure that everything you do is reversible are really good principles to work with.
Yeah. Well, time for one or two more. Yeah.
Thanks. Just on that conservation question then, what about in respect to material issues where you have obsolete materials? Basically, often architects of this period used innovative and interesting materials that were manufactured often for a period of time and then aren't. Some people who've written about this area say, well, you've got a serious problem there, and the idea of keeping or maintaining that fabric can be needlessly expensive and requires kind of museum-level conservation, which is unrealistic for most of the situations you're talking about. You know, I mean, it's one thing for Sydney Living Museums to do it, but, you know, what's your advice, I guess, Annalisa, or something, to someone who's just living in a more
I'm lucky.
ordinary
My
life?
house has a very, limited palette of natural materials, so I don't sort of have those issues. But obviously, yes, working in the industry, that does become an issue. And then it's deciding what you keep, what you don't keep, and what you put in, and how you identify what's old and what's new. And obviously, yes, the cost of maintaining these houses is a big issue, definitely. But, I look at the houses around me in Wahroonga that were built maybe 10, 15 years ago, and they're falling apart. My house is nearly 60 years old. So, I think that's a lot less cost, really, to myself and to the community than these houses. I always say, who's going to be fighting to save them in 50 years? So, yeah, it is an issue. It's just about education again, I think. And, I'm of the belief that if there is a new material that is going to perform better, use it. Russell's of that. Harry Seidler was the same. Architects, they were using the materials that were available at the time, and obviously cutting edge materials. So if they were doing the work now, they'd probably be using materials of today with today's technology.
So you would have to have some good advice.
Yes.
so that there is an appropriate replacement. Okay. With the Featherston house, which had a translucent roof, it leaked and grew mould over its history. And yet, Mary Featherston, only in the last 7 or 8 years, has replaced that roof because polycarbonate technology has got to the stage where Boyd wanted it to be, and they replaced it. So I think, it's actually looking with sympathy at what was intended if it's prohibitive, because not every owner is like the Getty Museum, which can afford it.
That was their third go at Featherston House, that roof.
Sorry?
I think that was their third
It
go
is.
at
Their
getting
third roof.
It was.
We've had an interesting experience at the Rose Seidler house that Harry Seidler actually used curtains quite a lot in houses, unlike many modernist architects. And he used materials that were very popular at the time. And for example, Rose Seidler house had beautiful curtains made of rayon crepe. Rayon was a sort of wonder material of the post-war period. It's as expensive as silk. Beautiful colours, but of course rayon's not, I think it's made in about 2 places in the world now, and so we really struggled to find replacement for that fabric, and this is this dilemma that you then go through of, what's a suitable alternative given everything else that's in the house and the sort of integrity of everything else. So finally we found someone who had a plain wool crepe that had a similar character, and we had it dyed the same colour. So it's a sort of compromise, but it's still, I think it fits with the integrity of the other materials.
And it was a second try. We got
And it
it
was a
wrong
second
the
try,
first
yeah.
time. So that often happens too, you take some risks. On that note, I'm going to say thank you very much to Philip Goad, Annalisa Capurro and Ian Innes for a really great panel. Thank you very much.